Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Tonight, in our penultimate reading before the summer break, we're delighted to be able to welcome three emerging talents from the world of fiction, non-fiction and poetry. Zinzi Clemmons, Tom Jeffreys and André Naffis-Sahely. Over the next hour, you'll get the chance to hear them read from their debuts, and in any time we have left at the end, quiz them on their work. I'll introduce each of our guests individually when the time comes, but before that, please do give it up for Zinzi, Tom and André. Okay, so first up tonight we have Tom Jeffreys on signal failure. Tom Jeffreys is a writer, editor and occasional curator with a particular interest in contemporary art that crosses over into the sciences or explores our relationship with the environment. His work has been published in Frieze, Monocle, Apollo, The Independent, The Daily Telegraph and The New Statesman, among many other publications. Tom is also the editor of The Learned Pig, an online magazine with 4 areas of interest: art, thinking, nature and writing. Signal Failure, London to Birmingham, HS2 on foot, Tom Jeffreys' first book-length work, documents his attempt to walk the 119 miles from London to Birmingham, along the proposed route of HS2, the second leg of Britain's high-speed network. Signal Failure is both personal and political, both poetic and philosophical. It's as much about one man's quest to understand his physical environment as our species' dilemma about how best to live in the world. The New Statesman called Signal Failure intelligent, engaging and engaged, and deeply disarmingly human. We're delighted to have Tom with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming him to Shakespeare and Company.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm glad you quoted the nice bits from the New Statesman, because the rest of it not so hot. Great, yeah, so I don't know if anyone knows a lot about HS2, but it is a big train line that is being planned to be built from London to Birmingham in the UK. It's very expensive, it's quite controversial. The advocates of the project think that it will solve a lot of economic problems in England. A lot of people disagree. It runs through kind of conservative voter heartland from London to Birmingham. About 2 years ago, I decided to walk the route. Most people then say, why did you want to walk the route? I still haven't really worked out a particularly great answer to that. I quite like walking. I don't really like camping. It's quite a long way. I'm terrible at map reading. It was a pretty bad idea. I guess the aim was to think about the people and the places along the way. I met a lot of people who will be directly affected by what's going to happen, who will have to leave their houses, who lose their businesses, who will have their lives changed in a way that they don't particularly like. What I'm going to do is read 3 little bits about maps. The kind of book tries to think about, it goes through the cities, suburbs, countryside. So I'm thinking about those kind of ideas. I'm also trying to think about community and how these particular communities will be affected by this particular project. It's kind of unavoidably a political book. Obviously, it's a political project. So I'm going to begin with a couple of quotations from Theresa May, I'm afraid, and then kind of place the book a little bit in its political context. It was quite difficult writing this. I don't know how much people are following UK politics, but it's pretty fast-moving at the moment, so anything book length becomes quite problematic in terms of just knowing who's Prime Minister or whatever. So anyway, so I'm going to read a short bit from the beginning, and then a couple of other bits related to maps and mapping, because I guess one of the things that interested me about doing the walk was the kind of discrepancy between the map. It went through a lot of areas that I didn't know at all, so I just got out a lot of maps and drew a line through them, and what the actual experience of doing that walk was like. And in some places it worked very well, and in many places it was less successful. Okay, so I'll begin with a bit of Theresa May just to kick things off with a bang. So this is from her speech when she became Prime Minister. When we take the big calls, we'll think not of the powerful, but you. When we pass new laws, we'll listen not to the mighty, but to you. We will make, and then this is a second quotation, we will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us. Okay, that's just a little bit from that. And then in terms of placing the book a little bit in a kind of political context. During the Brexit debate, there was a meme doing the rounds online. It was an image of an advertising hoarding by artist Robert Montgomery. On it, the following words. England is the first lie. England is a lie invading kings told you to take your actual land from you. This land is your land. From the flat Norfolk night to the blue Cornish morning. Just a wild, pagan land with no name and no flag. Just this cold beach that nourishes you. Just the wind on this grassland that nourishes you. Just the rain on your face in the morning in this blank springtime that nourishes you. What it meant to show, in part at least, is that the world is a wild place, and our structures of meaning and knowledge lie uneasily upon it. The map is not the territory, as has been famously written, especially when you're as bad at map reading as I am. More specifically, Montgomery is trying to show that nation-states are not a natural reality. They are real now and have real power, but they are also products of history. They have a beginning, and therefore one day, an end. Nationalism's lie is its tie to nature, blood to soil. But perhaps Montgomery's text here could be expanded upon. Perhaps there was a more fundamental lie. Perhaps the first lie was not England, but a pronoun, we. Underpinning this little word is the idea of a coherent community, based on similarity, that could be opposed along clearly definable lines to a near or distant but always different they. Nothing would change. Once all the maps were in place, no border could be breached nor lines crossed. But a lie can have a life. A lie can found a truth. As Theresa May's speech shows, we is always open to slippage, however much we reinforce the borders and purge the enemies within. Montgomery's text knows this too. Look how you gets used. In English, the exact same word in the singular and the plural. No wonder advertisers love it so much. No wonder May addresses us, you, me, them, as you directly. Here Montgomery adopts the same language. But who does he mean? May pits you against the mighty, Montgomery against invading kings. But where are they invading from? Across what border? How can the land be my land, our land, if it has no name and no flag? Ownership has its limits. Property requires borders. Borders can always, at least in principle, be crossed, for example, by a train line. Thinking takes place in the relationship of territory and the earth, wrote Deleuze and Guattari, the very place I hope this walk traverses too. Okay, so that's a little bit from the intro. Later on in the countryside, I meet with some people who live along the route who are protesting against the train line in a very kind of retired professional English way by writing letters to their politicians and generally being fairly ineffectual. But good on them, you know, they're having a tough time of it, so I shouldn't be sarcastic. Later on my walk, I'm given one of the publications from the draft environmental statement produced by HS2 with engineers URS and Arup in 2013. It's a map book for Community Forum Area 11, Stoke Mandeville and Aylesbury, and it's utterly baffling. Close-ups of the line have been rotated to fit the landscape format of the booklet, rather than to aid legibility. Pages are out of order. In The Power of Maps, artist, author and cartographer Dennis Wood argues that maps facilitate the reproduction of the culture that brings them into being. A map's effectiveness is the product of selectivity, what to include and what not to include, which is itself the product of a certain interest. Wood continues. Because these interests select what, from the vast storehouse of knowledge about the earth, the map will represent, these interests are embodied in the map as presences and absences. Every map shows this, but not that, and every map shows what it shows this way, but not the other. Not only is this inescapable, but it is precisely because of this interested selectivity, this choice of word or sign or aspect of the world to make a point, that the map is enabled to work. Maps, in short, have power. Looking at these HS2 maps, it's clear that important information about transportation routes, visibility or footpath access is barely mentioned. But more than that, what is left out is people. There are embankments and cuttings, landscape character areas and borough boundaries, material stockpiles and satellite construction compounds. There are temporary earthworks and temporary mitigation earthworks. There are watercourses and rights-of-way, and community forum boundaries, local nature reserves, special protection areas, and sites of special scientific interest. But there are no people. There is nothing about what people do or think or value. There are no animals either. Instead, we have maps of many colours and wide-angle panoramic photo montages showing what HS2 might look like in 2026, barely a hump on the horizon, several miles away. What is missing from such maps matters because it's possible to argue that the impact of HS2 is really less about the countryside, which is likely to recover in the long term, than it is about the people who live there. Up and down the line, I am told stories of people's health ruined by the worry of HS2 and the stress of having to fight it. Financial difficulties have long been linked with suicide rates, something only exacerbated by the recession following the 2008 banking crisis. With many people along the route facing severe financial losses in the form of plummeting house prices, it's hardly surprising that there is not only anger here, but sadness too. Jenny, who is one of the people I've just met, tells me of 2 men who are now on sleeping tablets and antidepressants. A farmer killed himself in Warwickshire. In a few days' time, I will meet a woman who admitted on national television to seriously considering suicide. That moment was the first her husband knew of her feelings, and he had felt the same. Across the UK, people are tired of being forgotten, of being left off the maps produced in London to be perused in London for the decisions made in London. It's the same story throughout the affected countryside. So as an example of this discrepancy between map and place, obviously there are serious implications such as the ones I've just touched upon. There's also less serious ones like my inability to walk the route in any particularly organised fashion. And the whole process, which should have taken 10 days, ended up I had to do it twice on account of getting lost so much and hurting my knee and generally being not very well equipped for this kind of lengthy walking journey. The last little couple of bits that I'm going to read are kind of an example of getting lost. And I kind of hadn't realised that the map I was using was a little bit out of date, and due to kind of developments that were being built, things were changing quicker than I had anticipated, and anyway, it didn't go very well. But yeah, I'm just going to read these last little bits, and then we're done. As the light begins to fade on the 4th afternoon, I am alone. On the map, Calvert Green in northern Buckinghamshire jars against the patterns of the surrounding countryside. No lazy orange contours meandering leisurely across a plain white background. No church with a spire. No pub. Here is only a large expanse of irregular black and white dots and splodges. It is the Ordnance Survey symbol for landfill. According to them, that is all we need to know of this area. Or perhaps it is all we can know. These kinds of waste landscapes change so quickly that mapping them is pointless. As soon as the ink is down on paper, the lines in the landscape have moved on. The interior may be a mystery, but the borders are clearly delineated. The site takes the form of 2 oblongs tilted anti-clockwise through 45 degrees or so. The larger is to the north, the smaller to the south, both constrained on one side by the presence of a railway line. Ruler straight, it divides green fields and evocatively named woods, sheep house and decoy pond, from the sandy expanse of silt and scar. Meeting the railway line at just off the perpendicular is a track running from the northwest down south and east with the same dead straight linearity that denotes the authority of map over land. Calvert's is a short history of extraction and intrusion. Today the vista is changing fast, but it remains just as strange. A working landscape with its own distinct aesthetic. 3 of the old clay pits here have been flooded. 2 are now vast lakes used for angling and kayaking, and 1 is a nature reserve for wildfowl. Another is a landfill site. Man has plundered what he can from Calvert, and now he is pumping back his rubbish. They've been filling it, I'm told, since the early 1980s. A layer of rubbish, then a layer of clay. A layer of rubbish, then a layer of clay. I skirt the crest of the hill just south of Finmere Woods on my way northwest from Quainton, and congratulate myself on my map reading today. I'm making steady progress, and I'm on track to make it to Calvert and set up my tent well before night. It's the by now familiar post-lunch high. Pride in this instance comes before rainfall. We're nearly done. In the near distance, the skeleton form of industry rises into the sky. It's the new incinerator I was told about yesterday. It's not on my map, and I'm starting to worry. The incinerator's industrial verticality is a sudden and disconcerting presence in the gently rolling landscape. I instantly begin to doubt the accuracy of my navigation, but it makes for some great photos. Not only is it huge and hideous, but also somehow thrilling. Like careful parents, a pair of orange cranes tend to their growing young, metal grids and concrete cladding growing from among green fields. One day soon it will fill its nest and the cranes will go elsewhere and build again afresh. Once it is up and running, the incinerator, or energy from waste facility as it is known, will produce 22 megawatts of electricity, enough to power up to 36,000 homes. Those who oppose such schemes are invariably labelled as NIMBYs, but nobody wants the techno-sublime in their backyard. The incinerator's rising bulk makes a useful navigational marker for the walker who has temporarily mislaid his bearings. At least it does for a time. The rain drives downwards. The surrounding countryside is a washed-out wall of slate grey. As I approach from the southeast, I expect to find a footpath running along the disused railway. But I cross over and no such path presents itself. Instead, here is a road. Brand new, it seems. Unmarked and unfinished. Perhaps I'm not exactly where I thought I was. I decide to follow it northwest as it heads, raw-edged, towards the incinerator's hollow hull. I hear the rising whine of a dog pack in the distance. Slowly, it advances towards me, no quicker than my own walking pace. Gradually, or perhaps all of a sudden, it dawns on me. These are not dogs, but the clanking whir of motorized machinery. Where in God's name am I? I look again and again at my map. The rain eases to a spatter on the plastic casing. There is no road where I'm walking. I'm in the middle of the map, yet I've disappeared off it, and I think my boots are beginning to leak. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. Next up, we have The Promised Land. André Naffis-Sahely was born in Venice to an Iranian father and Italian mother, and was raised in Abu Dhabi. His poetry has been featured in Ambit, Achete, The Best British Poetry 2014, PN Review and Swimmers, among many others, and his non-fiction writing has appeared in such publications as The Economist, The Times Literary Supplement, New Statesman and The White Review. He's also a literary translator from Italian and French. His selected poems of Abdelatif Lahabi, winner of Penn Translates Award, was published by Carcanet in 2016. The Promised Land, Poets from Itinerant Life, may carry the reader from Venice to Abu Dhabi, from London to North America. But André's first collection is no holiday, documenting as it does not just the itinerancy of travellers, but also of workers and of the dispossessed in precise language and haunting images. David Harsent has said that his poems usher the reader into a world of reversals and risk. His narratives hold memory to account. While in The Guardian, Pankaj Mishra chose it as one of his essential summer reads, calling the poems sharp meditations on our vast but remarkably homogeneous global landscape. I should also add that some years ago, André was one of our esteemed tumbleweeds, making his home here amongst the shelves for several months and then again in our writer's studio a little after. With that in mind, please join me in welcoming André Naffis-Sahely back to Shakespeare and Company.
Thank you, Adam, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming here, and thank you, Tom, as well. I should really start by saying that although I have and will be reading at various places, this is my one and only true homecoming. As Adam said, I was here in 2008, and thanks to the, I think, wild, really, generosity of George and Sylvia, I was able to actually start writing the poems that eventually made it back in this book here. And I think one of the defining moments for me being here was spending a lot of nights trying to fall asleep, reading books, and looking at that sign, "Be not inhospitable to strangers, lest they be angels in disguise." Of course, that's become a very famous motto. That's pack and parcel with this bookshop, really. But I think at the time I really took it in a deeper philosophical meaning, not to sound too pretentious. The simple reason for that is because I was looking for a home. And I found a home here with the members of staff, with friends I made here, and with the authors on these shelves. The reason why I was looking for a home is, as Adam said, my mother's Italian from Venice and my father's Iranian from Tehran. But through a series of circumstances, I was raised in Abu Dhabi, which is my real hometown. I am from Abu Dhabi. The reason why I suppose it took a book to explain what that means is because Abu Dhabi is not a real city. It's not the real city of a real. It's not the real capital of a real country. And the whole time I was growing up there, in fact, it was always referred to as a miracle or phenomenon rather than a city. And this poem attempts to summarize that. It's called Disposable Cities. They begin as blips on the horizon of prospects, rumors, snippets of exaggerated talk, too fabulous to believe, but too alluring to forget. Something has been found. Gold, silver, uranium, coltan, or oil. Before long, the prospect of immeasurable wealth drowns all incredulity. The migration begins. The engineers in their hard hats and linens are the first on the ground, and with them come the derricks, the drills, the platforms, the dry docks. Pipelines sink their tentacles into every lucrative crevice marked on the map. The maps are kept secret. A handful of shacks are erected to provide a few basic services. Soon enough, the handful swells into a hamlet, then a village, and finally a city. Such cities are the perfect sort of settlement for the modern world. Everything is shipped in, everything is easily assembled. Their primary and overriding purpose is to extract, process, and distribute. Just like a motorized pump draws water out of a well, they start inhaling people from all over the world, one desperado at a time. At first, these fresh arrivals find their new homes unsettling. They find it difficult to adjust to the weird climates and are frazzled by the confusion of languages. No one is under any illusions. They are ephemeral guests, non-citizens. Belonging is a dream best forgotten or deferred. Most people have come empty-handed, having traded their old lives for grub stakes. Lots of money slushes around, but most of it is spent simply surviving. And when it runs out, people watch their lives fall apart. Everyone exists in a heightened state of awareness. One false move, and they're gone. The poorer they are, the more modest their gambles, which more often than not make them poorer. Beggars don't build homelands, they tell themselves, fantasizing about the day when they might return home and become somebody. The myth, meanwhile, has traveled to the four corners of the planet. More than cities, these Eldorados are a state of mind, places where people come to reinvent themselves and realize their most eccentric fantasies. All cities live out their lot and die, but these disposable cities are special. They thrive in areas of the world generally deemed inhospitable or uninhabitable. In Greenland, in Siberia, the Amazon, the Yukon, or the empty quarter. They are mushrooms of greed, requiring no loving care or attention. They simply erupt and flourish. Yet their fame is fleeting. Once they're bled dry, these cities' roads go raw with potholes. Chickens roam loose in the opera houses. Power lines sag, and rot seeps in, tarring all in sight. Only on those unlucky enough not to make it and stay in town for the decline. One day, the wind howls, and the last tent comes undone. The lie has moved on to the next disposable city. When I was a child, my mother used to tell me that lies had short legs and thus could not get very far. Somebody lied to her. Thank you. Following on from be not inhospitable to strangers lest they be angels in disguise, because I really think that was a key line for me. Abu Dhabi is an island, much like Venice, so in that way there wasn't much of a difference. I guess I swapped gondolas for camels. But at the same time, it's a city that, despite being wonderfully cosmopolitan and wonderfully inclusive, is actually an island of strangers. And this poem I'm about to read was conceived, I think, around the time when I was 15, and I knew I had a couple of years, or or so to make up my mind as to where to go. Now, I'm sure most people here have at least heard of Abu Dhabi, or perhaps its more famous sibling, Dubai. And these are cities, or rather city-states in the way the Greeks and the medieval Italians used to conceive of them, that have roughly 86% of the population are foreigners. And one very little under-discussed fact is that the children of expatriates who go to the Emirates, or anywhere else in the Gulf, for that matter, once the male children turn 18, they have to leave the country. Now, they make an exception for women, obviously because they want to keep an eye on them before they're married off. So there is that exception. At the same time, male children are packed off once they turn 18. And this poem is called An Island of Strangers. The rooftop was the place to be. I was 15 and in love with ash cans, pigeon coops, women hanging their laundry. There was a 50-foot portrait of the king by the sea, overlooking a busy junction, always smiling, like an ad for toothpaste or mouthwash. At night, the shore on the west side of town was the quietest, where hotels, Natashas, and haram coalesced into parties. Every half-lit room was a sure sign of orgasms and the passing of money from stranger to stranger. Anything interesting or pleasurable was haram. I envied the king and his sons, all 18 of them. The king was virile, a patriarch, Abraham on Viagra. His people, on the other hand, were on Prozac. Everywhere the eye looked was money. The nose hit only sweat, acrid, pugnacious, pervasive. Most of the boys I knew sucked butane, smoked, saved up for prostitutes, waited for their parole in the summer, each back to his own country. Come September, the dissatisfied return. Misfit mutts, at home everywhere and nowhere. A friend once compared cosmopolitanism to being stuck at summer camp, to waiting for parents who never showed up. In the 33rd year of his smile, the king finally died. His mausoleum is a meringue, wavy, white, and empty. His sons have gone on squabbling, playing who's is biggest with their bricks. One by one, they die in car crashes. Days of heat strokes, kif, and bloodthirsty Ferraris. I like to use facts in my poems, and one of the important facts of that poem is that the king's sons do die like flies. The youngest, I believe, died at the age of 18 because his daddy decided that it was time to buy him a helicopter. But because he was the prince, he didn't need helicopter lessons. So he took off in his brand new helicopter, and 15 minutes later, just tumbled into the sand. Now, he did get a funeral and a burial, which is something that people there are denied. When I was growing up there, I remember my father was very good friends with a Palestinian family who had been there since 1949, believe it or not. Now, oil was discovered there in the 50s. It started to be extracted and produced on an industrial scale in the 60s, as far as I'm aware. But my father's friend's father went there in 1949, so not long after the 48 war. And there are now 4 generations of that family in that country. They actually run one of the biggest chicken farms in the Northern Emirates, and they still have to renew their visas once a year. And it really struck me, I think, even as a child, the fact that there were no cemeteries, or that there were very few cemeteries with too few bodies, in a sense that this was a country of millions of people, and the biggest graveyard I could find had maybe 100 headstones on it, which didn't seem quite right. And this is the reason why. Vanishing Act. Only 2 out of 10 people die in Abu Dhabi. The rest simply fail to have their visas renewed. They are bagged, tagged, and placed on the next available flight back to wherever they first came from, the one-way ticket experience par excellence. Every edifice on this island is crafted by these almost nothings. In death, at least, there is solace. Never again to queue for days on end. Never again to have their fingertips inked and pressed by intolerant hands, their blood screened for undesirable illnesses, their flesh seared by a sun that wonders what the hell they're doing there. Now, this might displease some British members in the audience. There is a type in Dubai, I think especially. They're called Jumeirah Jains. And the reason for that is the UAE is built on an informal apartheid caste system. Jobs are for the most part race specific. And for a long time, in fact, I was speaking to someone today whose sister and brother-in-law work in Dubai, and they're white Europeans, and they told me that things have changed, and I know they've changed. But once upon a time, it used to be that unless you were one of the undesirable races, that if you were one of the prime job candidates, meaning white, the only way that the Emiratis could lure you over to work in those kind of temperatures would be to give you the kind of package that you would never get anywhere else. A beautiful house, a beautiful car, servants. And yet they complained. And this is what they used to say. Jumeirah Jains. A hill station breeze blows through the cafe. The ladies are dressed for high tea, and the waiters polish the windows that keep the hot sand at bay. Life here has left a bitter film on their lips, which they purse whenever one of them mentions how her children have gone home, and her husband works 6-day weeks even during the summer. As if that weren't enough, the servants are lazy. Then there are the locals, who are ignorant, venal, tasteless, and even worse, lucky. The ladies are lonely. They want to go back to the UK. But then, one of them says, we're so comfortable here. At which point, all conspiracy dies. And like moody nuns, the ladies nod in acknowledgement, and their talk drifts back to the weather. Now, the Emirates, well, actually, I should probably say, earlier in Disposable Cities, I said that Abu Dhabi is, let's say, another installment of that phenomenon that's been recurring throughout our history the past couple hundred years. And everything is shipped in and easily assembled, and even war to this point, because I don't know if many of you know, right now the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been leading a 3-year bombing campaign against Yemen. And the way they have done it, I think this might be the first example in warfare where not only did they buy the bombs from Britain and America and France, and they bought the airplanes from Britain, America, and France, they also got the pilots on loan. Because even though they have a standing army and pour billions into it, they do not have qualified pilots who are able to drop those bombs. So right now we have British and French pilots dropping bombs, British and American and French bombs from British and American and French warplanes while bearing an Emirati flag. All abetted by Donald Trump, of course. And one of the interesting things I think I'd like to say, looping back again to the be not inhospitable to strangers. Qatar is actually the only country in the Gulf that has seen fit to recognize the situation at the moment and say, well, we can't invite millions of people over here and have them spend decades of their lives, have them set up their families here without giving them a right to remain. And so one of the agendas that the Saudis and the rest of the Gulf Council have against Qatar is that the Qataris are actually contemplating naturalizing citizens. God forbid. Why would they want to do that, right? But anyway, the Emirati government is essentially a monarchic theocracy. And I've met a few journalists there, and this is based on a conversation. It's called The Foreign Correspondent. I do not like the taste in my mouth. To remonstrate would be better. To keep my mouth shut would be best. I can count, and I know how many lost their nerves at the sight of the dictator's smile, and how many more died in silence, sliding down the slick wall of his teeth. I've been told I sound very, very American, and I think naturally enough, or perhaps fate led me that way, I left Britain after 11 years, because after I left the UAE, I decided to go to Britain for my education. And 3 years ago, I moved to the US to be with my wife, Zinzi. And this is a poem I wrote when, and I think Zinzi and I talked about this, when the ugly, ugly smell of Trump was in the air. And it's called In the Shadow of Monadnock. The bronze Union soldier stands guard on the green. Behind him, the town hall where his forefathers voted to live free or die is for sale. The Republic slides to insolvency, and the few "Yes we can" stickers still left in the windows are beginning to bleach. Spring loosens its hold on the rivers. The rich smell of rot wafts out from the leaves, and something moves in the shadowy pines that sway in the strong winds and creak like rusty doors in a horror film. A fast hammering can be heard. Those woodpeckers know which tree is next to die. I sit on the sagging porch of Joe's red colonial and watch the last ribbons of paint peel away from the shingles. There are 5 bedrooms inside, but only one is kept warm. No TV or radio either. The news upsets Walter. Joel's girls left long ago, off to plow the hard field of the city. The milk cow that saw them to adulthood died last year. New money is spreading like moss while the locals are losing their homes. It was easier once, Joe said. You worked the land. You were born, you worked the land, and then the land worked you back into it. Now the grocery bags grow thinner and thinner, but Joe means to stick it out. Birds whose names elude us shatter the silence in a good way, maybe the best. I inhale the crisp New England air and exhale a panegyric. Joe smiles. She tells me that quite a few of the folk up here are suffering from asthma. They can thank Pennsylvania for that, she says. It's the dust carried north from the coal mines on the breeze. There is hatred, envy, and greed afoot in our world, wrote an old Saxon poet, and this is where you must live, among the thieves and the killers. Back in the square, I stare into the dead coins of the soldiers' eyes and almost hear the trumpets. There's nowhere to run. I've been reading this at other events, but for once I actually get to have Hugh here, and so it's the time for it. This is upstate New York, and it's called In the Catskills for Zinzi. We were trapped in a town called Liberty. Our cabin lay on top of a hill, where the snow kept us caged for entire weeks at a time. Down the dirt road, past a couple of bends, lay the hamlet of Neversink, which of course had been drowned by a reservoir. It was hard to think of anything human around us as serious. All that men had built reeked of failure and rust. We lived amidst the ruined remnants of a Yankee frontier town. Slumbering mills, silent railroads, idle factories, gutted houses, and a few drowsy strip malls. It was the nonsensical heart of angry America, where descendants of Unionists proudly flew Dixie flags just to spite the dark man in the White House. The one half-decent bite to eat was at Stew's, a blue Cullman diner formerly on 49th and 11th that got pushed out by franchises, then exiled upstate on a flatbed, never to return. When the mulch plant shut down, the sons and daughters of Liberty debated at length the great prospects before them. Casinos or fracking. But the rich second homeowners fought the oil man and won, so casinos it was. Liberty, son, an old school teacher told me, is where the past comes to die. Ain't it funny to think, my beloved, that this was where our future began? I'm gonna end with a short poem about the ample rewards of writing poetry, and I assure you they are ample. This is a story based on one of my favorite Iranian poets, Firdausi, who wrote the national epic, the Shahnameh, which is the Book of Kings. The poem is called Put Not Your Trust in Princes. After 4 decades of early mornings and late nights, Firdausi had completed his epic, the Shahnameh, and thus he decided to visit Sultan Mahmud, who had once promised him a gold piece per couplet. Firdausi, had written 60,000 of them. Unfortunately, Sultan Mahmud was dejected. The long years of peace were proving hard to bear without the rich, gluey feel of blood on his hands. He sent the poet home with a mere sack of silver. But years later, as the Sultan was about to ride into battle, a minister recited a sad song of singular beauty. And when the Sultan learned that Ferdowsi was its author, he immediately sent him a caravan laden with gold. But as the caravan entered the city through one gate, Ferdowsi's remains were being wheeled out the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. Wonderful stuff. And so now, last but certainly not least, Zinzi Clemmons. Zinzi was raised in Philadelphia by a South African mother and an American father. A graduate of Brown and Columbia, her writing has appeared in Zoetrope All Story, the Paris Review Daily, Transition, and elsewhere. She's a co-founder and former publisher of Apogee Journal and a contributing editor to Literary Hub. She lives in Los Angeles, where she teaches at the Colburn Conservatory and Occidental College. What We Lose, Zinzi Clemens' debut, is a taut, visceral, yet lyrical work, written with the assurance and restraint one might expect from a novelist with several more books under her belt. An intimate and insightful examination of grief, Clemens' distinct voice and mastery of the language has led The Independent to call What We Lose luminescent, the Sunday Times to describe it as a lovely little head rush of a novel, and Vogue to pick it as one of their debut novels of the year. If that weren't enough, Paul Beattie has said that Zinzi Clemens' debut novel signals the emergence of a voice that refuses to be ignored. We're thrilled to have her with us tonight, so please give it up for Zinzi Clemens.
Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here. I travel quite a bit, Andre and I especially together, and I always used to say that I would always feel relieved coming back to the States from wherever I'd gone, no matter how nice the destination, but now it feels like a much-needed vacation from the chaos that's going on over there. And I think your last few poems were a really great introduction. I think that there in the States there's a pretty stark divide between the people who saw Trump coming and the people who didn't. And the ones who are sort of unsurprised are the ones who kind of see the sadness and desperation that's going on in our country, and the ones who were shocked tend not to and tend to be satisfied. I won't unpack that any further, but I'll say Andre is definitely someone who saw the sadness. And when we were together in the place he just described, we saw it together. So I'm going to read a little bit from my novel. It is about... It's basically... It's narrated by a young woman named Tandi, whose mother is South African and her father is American, and she grows up in the States. And her mother, this is not a spoiler, her mother passes away from cancer, and the entire book is a meditation about that loss and what that feels like. And it's also structured in an unconventional way. So if you can imagine a narrator in the present who is looking back on memories from the past, and in the present tense, she is growing up, falling in love, and contemplating a family of her own. And what effect that has on her is that it jogs all of these memories of the passing of her mother. And if you know about the way that memory works, it's sort of very true to that process. So, songs tend to jog memories, smells do, and these kinds of experiences do as well. And the book sort of jumps from one memory, which is they're all written in these short little vignettes from one to another, sort of by topic. And so I'm going to read a few of those now. Good? Thanks. I'm guessing I was too close.
That's fine.
It's okay? Yeah. Okay, cool. My parents were never openly affectionate with each other or with me. I never saw them exchange more than a quick squeeze on the shoulders at the end of the day, a chaste peck on the cheek before the other left the house. I learned about sex in my liberal primary school, which ensured we were given healthy doses of sex ed starting in kindergarten. We were given permission slips to have our guardians sign tacit acknowledgement for my parents that their duty was being farmed out successfully. At home, even the word sex was censored out of conversation. It was as if it didn't exist in our house. Sex was only a problem of the wild, tainted world outside. But then one night, while I was in junior high, I heard my parents making love. I heard my mother panting loudly and eventually screaming, and my father grunting in rhythm. I pulled my blanket over my head, terrified, shivering. I lay there for the rest of the night, my heart pumping, exhilarated and unable to sleep. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but when I looked back years later, after experimenting and then making those sounds on my own, I felt something different than fear. Familiarity, and perhaps some satisfaction that my parents were, despite their coldness, and love. In the weeks after my mother died, my sex drive was merciless. I was stuck in my bedroom while family and friends circulated in the apartment's outer rooms and hallways, barely able to leave my room, embarrassed for my eyes and nose that ran like faucets, my face blotched with red from wiping all the tears away. Amina came and went, but there weren't distractions of the magnitude I needed to keep me from suffering. I masturbated often, mostly at night, but sometimes in the day, while I could hear the voices of my parents' friends muffled through my bedroom door. I cycled through relief, then shame and horror, desperate for the release and powerless to stop the urge. I longed for the touch of someone else, but all I had was my hand. During the day, I envisioned my mother watching over me, and that comforted me. But when the urge inevitably came, I fought to banish the thought of her, while pitifully jerking myself off in my childhood bed. I work for a public health agency in Forest Hills, Queens, a job that has systematically robbed me of my idealism since the day I started. With every day that goes by, every person who passes through our door, I banish further the possibility of anything ever truly changing for the better. I admitted this to my boss, an overweight, middle-aged woman with dull red hair and 3 ex-husbands. She laughed at me. "So you're finally getting it, huh?" she said, and walked away from me, cackling all the way down the hall. They sent me to a conference on HIV and AIDS pharmaceuticals in Oregon. I spent 4 boring days floating disinterestedly from presentation to hotel bar before I noticed Peter sitting across the table from me. He was attractive, with dark red hair and serious eyes, high cheekbones, and a slight curve to his shoulders that suggested muscles, experience. That night, after everyone had eaten dinner and retired to their rooms, he was sitting alone at a table in the bar, something dark and half-drunk in his glass. I asked to sit with him tentatively. I was nervous that he would, for some reason, say no. When he pulled out the chair for me, I noticed that he was reading a book, a new biography of Malcolm X. I had just read a review of the book and tried to impress him with my knowledge. He looked at me, interested but nonchalant, and asked if I had read the other biography released this year. No, I had to admit, trying not to let my defeat show. He told me he was 33, 7 years older than me. I repeated the Elijah Muhammad teaching my father had told me, that the ideal age for a woman should be 1/2 of the man's age plus 7 years. He smiled with one side of his mouth and sat forward in his chair. I knew that I had him. He told me that he had left a PhD program in literature a year ago. Global health was his plan B. It wasn't working out so well for him. "I'm bored to death," he told me, dropping a heavy palm on the Malcolm X book. Instead of helping people in need, he was managing a bunch of recent college grads. I admitted that I was bored too, and this time we both laughed. This was the first time I actually saw his face, actually saw him. I imagined him stroking my hair, what it would feel like to look at him across my pillow. We talked excitedly, with no breaks in conversation. I forgot to order a drink, and before I knew it, it was 3 a.m. We were assigned a site visit together on the other side of town. Afterward, he took me cruising through the streets of Portland. He showed me around downtown and Chinatown, and then took me to King, lined with hair salons and corner stores. He pointed out the shabby high school where his father worked as principal. We ended up on the Columbia River near the entrance to the Hawthorne Bridge and watched the expanse slowly lift into the air to allow a boat to pass underneath. He parked in a lot and we sat on the hood, our arms braced over our winter coats. My mind was 6 moves ahead. I thought of my hands moving through his hair, what his breath smelled like up close. He told me that he was moving the following week to a larger apartment with his girlfriend. The words came out coldly, and he didn't look at me after. We sat for a few more moments outside, and then I politely thanked him for the driving tour. We climbed back into his car, and he drove me back to the hotel, where I barely slept that night, restless in my empty room. The next day, I got on a plane back to the East Coast, exhausted. Afterward, I thought of him often, remembering the warm, excited feeling I felt for those hours I sat in the passenger seat of his car. But I was angry that he had led me on, and I didn't reach out to him. 8 months later, he emailed me, saying that he and his girlfriend had finally broken up. He invited me to Portland to stay with him for the weekend, saying he'd pay for the flight. I didn't hesitate much, but I also didn't tell anyone. One afternoon in my senior year of high school, I came home to what I thought was an empty house. I wrestled out of my backpack and jacket, propped my feet up on the couch, and laid my head down. As the day drifted away and I began to sleep, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. It was the familiar sound of a body shifting on a bed, the floorboards complaining underneath, then a faint, muffled sniffle. Upstairs, my mother was curled up on her bed, her eyes red. She was still wearing her work outfit, gray blazer, pleated skirt. Her collared shirt was unbuttoned, and her stockinged feet poked out from under the covers. She had been in pain for the past 2 weeks. That morning, she had gone to the doctor to find out the results of her tests, and had stayed in bed since. The pain had started in her chin, an aching that came out of nowhere and spread to her spine. She had had difficulty getting out of bed the past few days. She told me how scared she was, and the tears kept coming and coming. I had to ask her to stop, to calm down, and surprisingly, she listened to me, if out of nothing else than desperation. "If they don't know what it is, why should you worry?" I asked. She smiled at me, my naive logic seeming to calm her. She laughed softly. I kissed her, and then excused myself to go downstairs and switched on the television. The pain continued, and the doctors continued to be confounded. The air at home was decidedly anxious. Our family dinners of curries and aromatic roasts ceased. My father fixed simple, utilitarian meals that filled my stomach and suited my mother's health restrictions. I brought a tray to my mother's bedroom every evening and ate at the kitchen table with my father. He fumbled with the dishes and silverware as the sound of the TV buzzed from upstairs. "Thank you," my mother would say as she stared at the television. She would hug me or touch my cheek, and I would look deep in her eyes, searching for something that had already gone. At last, a chain of referrals led to an oncologist. I was called to the office at school on the day of the appointment, and I was almost relieved to learn what it was, even though it was the worst possible outcome, because it ended this horrible period of not knowing. He is waiting for me at the airport, carries my small suitcase all the way to his blue hatchback. We kiss in the car, chastely, tentatively. His apartment is on the top floor of a 3-story building in King. The landlady is an old Russian woman who smokes at the bottom of the back stairwell and cries every night. She has no family and no visitors. Her life is a mystery that I fill in with tragedy. His apartment is a one-bedroom, spare, decorated with brown thrift store furniture. It smells faintly of mothballs and cologne. In the living room are 4 towering bookcases. None of them match. The books overflow from the shelves, stacked in corners, piled on the coffee table. We sit in the kitchen and he makes me peppermint tea. When I finish the tea, he takes the cup from me and puts his lips to my forehead. I sigh. We embrace and sink into each other. We find our way to his small bedroom and his low platform bed. He undresses me and runs his fingertips all over my body. We're like 2 halves of a whole joining. There is no space between us, no awkwardness. We lie in bed for many hours afterwards, smiling, tracing the light from the window on our skin. That evening, he takes me shopping at the neighborhood market. It is a pioneering food co-op that also runs a food bank on weekends, serving different income types in the area. We stroll down the aisles. I push the cart from behind, and he steers with his hand on the front. He pauses every few steps to hold up an item. You like this? You need this? Do you drink dairy milk? I prefer rice. I say yes to granola, rice milk, a young organic chicken, lemon, fresh rosemary, and baby potatoes. When he goes out for work on my 3rd night, I take the chicken out of the fridge, wash it, and pat it dry. I load it into his only suitable baking pan. My hands shake as I grease the skin with olive oil and rub salt and pepper all over the body. My knife wriggles as I cut the lemon in half and squeeze citrus over the bird. I tear the leaves off the rosemary and dot them all over the skin, shoving the stems deep inside the cavity, along with the spent lemon halves. The baby potatoes I run under the tap, trying to be gentle as I massage off the grit under warm water. My mother taught me how to roast a chicken to succulent moistness inside and crispiness outside. She taught me that men don't always need, but they love, a woman who can cook and keep house. It wasn't sexism, she said. Such a disavowal, I noted, was usually a signal that it was. Domesticity was harder to find in a partner now because of feminism, and just like a job candidate who can code HTML, it was something that set you above the others. As I lift the chicken, covered in foil, into the oven, I worry that I have not remembered my mother's instructions correctly. Is it an hour at 350 degrees or 400? Or do I start at 350 and then move up to 400 when I remove the foil? What if the oven is irregular? What if, no matter how perfectly I cook the chicken, he doesn't like it? Then I would be a bad feminist and a bad cook. I shove the bird into the oven and collapse onto the floor. A few hours later, Peter returns home. He sets the table and pours us wine. He eats each bite through a satisfied smile, and I realize that, even if the chicken had been charred or half raw, I would never have known the difference from his face. To my taste, it is seasoned well, but a little on the dry side. We spend the next 3 days in bed, except when we are carousing the city hand in hand, feeling like everything is brand new and also ours. On the plane ride home, I look at my calendar, making plans for my next visit. When I get home, I make the announcement. I call Amina and my father. It's official, real this time. I'm in love.
Thank you so much, Zinzi. And that is, in fact, all we've got time for. We're not going to have a chance for a Q&A, but it's quite all right because the evening is not quite over yet. You'll get a chance to ask as many questions as you want to André, to Zinzi and to Tom while they are signing books, while you are drinking wine. So do hang around for that. We have stacks of all 3 of their wonderful books at the counter. You know, obviously, you won't believe this from a bookseller, but I'd say probably you want to take all 3 home with you now because many years down the line, you'll be having your signed first editions and they're going to be worth a lot of money. Not that you'll ever want to part with them. Anyway, all of that to say, this was our second to last event of the season. The final one is on Thursday. Then we take a bit of a break for August, back in September. I hope to see as many of you as possible on Thursday. Otherwise, please do just join me one more time in giving it up for André, for Zinzi, and for Tom.